Thank you, Devan, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm talking this evening about relations between the British and the Kurds before, during, and after World War I. And my research uses reports produced by the British government and the India Office, and also the written accounts and photographs of British administrators based in Kurdistan at that time. As less original documentation survives to tell this story from the Kurdish perspective, I've conducted interviews with Kurdish academics and descendants of Kurdish leaders to try and bring a balanced perspective. However, this is a contentious topic, and the narrative I'm presenting is certainly not the only way in which this complex series of historical events can be interpreted. The British public may be familiar with Iraq and Kurdistan through more recent events, such as the US-led invasion of 2003 and the defeat of ISIS from 2014. But they are less aware of Britain's role in establishing the state of Iraq after World War I and in creating the circumstances which promised and then denied independence for the Kurds. The Kurds as an ethnic group are distributed between the modern states of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And for today's story, we're looking to the Kurdish region that falls within the modern state of Iraq, specifically the area around Soleimani, as indicated here by the arrow. In modern-day Iraq, the three largest demographic groups are Shia Arabs in the center and south, shown in green, Sunni Arabs in the center and northwest, shown in yellow, and Kurds in the northeast, shown in purple. However, until the creation of Iraq after World War I, this region was known to the British as Mesopotamia, the Greek name for the land between two rivers. It was the cradle of civilization, the site of Nineveh and Babylon. However, this long history is not the subject of today's talk, so I'll begin with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans conquered Mesopotamia in the early 16th century, but never gained complete control. Their geographical reach was maintained through local proxy rulers. Several Kurdish emirates existed in the 16th to 19th centuries during the state of continuous warfare between the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Iran. And one of these was the Principality of Baban, centered on Soleimani, again indicated here by the arrow. The modern history of the Baban begins with the rise of Baba Suleiman in 1670. In 1784, Ibrahim Pasha built the new town of Soleimani, possibly on the site of an earlier town established by Baba Suleiman. In the decades following the Treaty of Ezram in 1823, the Persian threat was reduced, and the Ottomans brought the Kurdish emirates under more direct control. In 1847, the last Baban prince, Ahmad Pasha, was defeated, and Baban autonomy came to an end. In modern times, up to 1918, the Ottoman Empire was divided into vilayets, and the Iraq of today is composed of the former vilayets of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. The Kurds in what is now Iraq were concentrated mostly in the Mosul vilayet, which was subdivided into the three sanjaks of Mosul, Kirkuk, and Soleimani. Sanjaks were later on referred to in the Arabic as liwa. At its height, the Ottoman Empire ruled the Middle East, much of North Africa, and southeastern Europe. But by the late 1800s, the empire was in decline. The Ottomans owed more than £2 million to European banks, and trade had fallen behind powers such as Britain and France. They did, however, retain many strategic coastlines and ports, and these were coveted by the great European powers. Britain seized control of Egypt in 1882, securing the British route to India via the Suez Canal. However, the British policy in Mesopotamia, up until 1914, was to protect the Ottoman Empire against the Russians and other predators. This was mainly to safeguard the overland British route to India via the port of Basra and the Persian Gulf. And you can see this here with the blue line crossing through Mesopotamia down to Basra and then on through the Gulf to India. However, with the increasing importance of oil to the British Navy, these priorities were to change. In 1911, Winston Churchill was made First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill sought to modernise Britain's Royal Navy by adopting oil as fuel for its ships instead of coal. The benefits of this were proven, but while Britain's domestic production of coal was plentiful, it had no source for oil, either domestically or within its empire. In June 1914, Churchill convinced the House of Commons to authorise the government purchase of a 51% share in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. 2 weeks later, an assassin killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, and 6 weeks after that, Germany attacked France. The Great War had begun, and by its end, war without oil would be unimaginable. The German government had been hoping that the Ottomans would enter the war on their side, but Istanbul was undecided. On the 29th of October 1914, Ottoman ships, recently purchased from Germany and still captained by their German admiral, raided ports on the Russian coast in a brazen display of hostility. The Russians declared war on the 2nd of November, followed by the British and the French 3 days later. An Indian expeditionary force was sent to the Gulf to protect Basra and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's Abadan oil refinery against possible Turkish attack. The safety of Basra and Abadan required defense in depth against the Ottomans still holding the rest of Mesopotamia. This required the occupation of Baghdad, but a series of setbacks meant that the provincial capital was not taken until August 1917. Meanwhile, secret agreements were being made for the partition of Ottoman territory in the event of an Allied victory. The French demanded control of Syria, while Britain wanted to control the Persian Gulf and keep possible rivals away from Basra. Their negotiations, led by Sir Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot, resulted in the now infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. However, a parallel set of proposals had been developed by the British in Cairo, which were later said to be inconsistent with Sykes-Picot. In a series of letters exchanged with the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, the British government agreed to recognise Arab independence after the war in exchange for the Sharif and his Hashemite family launching an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Led by Emir Faisal, second son of Sharif Hussein, Arab forces expelled the Ottomans from the Hijaz, a campaign later romanticised by T. Lawrence. On the 5th of October 1918, with the blessing of the British General Allenby, Faisal declared the formation of an Arab government in Damascus. While Faisal's army and General Allenby's Egyptian expeditionary force were pursuing the retreating Ottoman forces through Syria, the Indian army was advancing in parallel up the river Tigris towards Mosul. An armistice was signed with the defeated Ottoman Empire at Mudros on the 30th of October 1918, and hostilities ceased the following day. The Indian troops pursuing the Ottoman army were then 40 miles south of Mosul, and the military occupation of that city did not take place until the 10th of November. Since this occurred after the armistice, the Turks continued to claim until 1926 that the Mosul Vilayet was theirs. To counter Turkish claims in the Mosul Vilayet, the British hoped to establish one or more Kurdish provinces to be loosely attached to whatever administration might ultimately be established in Baghdad. This map, from a British cabinet memorandum in November 1918, shows a proposed Kurdistan, together with the smaller Assyrian Christian principality in green, shown here. In their search for a figure with widespread public support to head this autonomous Kurdish region, British political officers had been in contact with prominent Kurds in Kirkuk and Suleimani, in particular with Sheikh Mahmoud Bazanji, head of the leading Sayyid family of southern Kurdistan. Sayyid is an honorific surname bestowed upon descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. In addition to being a Sayyid, Mahmoud was also a Shaikh, the head of an important branch of the Qadari Sufi order. Sheikhs of outstanding personality have commonly been credited with the power of working miracles, attracting the veneration of their disciples. They and their descendants have, in consequence, tended to also acquire worldly power. Kak Ahmad, great-grandfather of Sheikh Mahmoud, was credited with numerous miracles, including that of a bulletproof cloak which saved the life of the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid. Sheikh Mahmoud's Barzanji clan had become one of the most influential families during the Ottoman period, not only in Suleimani, but all of southern Kurdistan, in terms of their religious, social, and economic importance. The principal narrative for this story, as told from a British perspective, as well as the common link between its main characters, is provided by Cecil Edmonds. Edmonds studied Arabic, Turkish, and Persian at Pembroke College, Cambridge. After the declaration of war, he was summoned to Basra in April 1915. After spells with troops on the Tigris and Euphrates, Edmonds was posted in December 1916 to Shushtar, the ancient town near the principal oil field of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. There he had as colleagues Major Sohn to the north as Assistant Political Officer, or APO Dizful, and Major Noel to the south as APO Ahwaz. Both characters are to feature later in our story. In 1919, Edmonds was given a new position in Kirkuk, where he begins his narrative by describing the region's Kurdish tribes. One of the most important tribes of southern Kurdistan, the Jaf, consisted of a ruling aristocratic family settled in Halabja and a number of nomadic clans. Towards the end of their administration, the Ottomans had appointed Usman Pasha of the ruling Jaf family as Kaymakam, or root governor, in Halabja. However, authority had passed even during his lifetime to his wife Adala Khanum. By the time of the British occupation, Adala Khanum was a widow and became a staunch supporter of the British administration, who affectionately referred to her as Lady Adala. Jamchamal and Bazian were the territory of the Hamawand, probably the most celebrated fighting tribe of southern Kurdistan. They had supported the Baban princes against the Ottoman Empire and, after the extinction of the principality, continued to be a menace to the Ottoman administration. On several occasions, the Hamawand transfers themselves for several years across the Persian frontier. After one Hamawand rebellion in 1888, their chief was assassinated by the Persians. They fled back to Bazian and were subsequently exiled by the Turks, half to Tripoli and half to Adana. The Hamawand's fighting return from North Africa to Bazian 7 years later is among the greatest epics of Kurdish tribal history. The Pijdar tribe controlled the remote district of Rania. Babakar Aga was the chief of Pijdar, but a claim to this title by his cousin, Abbas-i Mahmud Aga, resulted in diverging loyalties later in our story. Major Noel, previously a colleague of Edmonds in Persia, was sent to Suleimani to set up a temporary system of administration under Sheikh Mahmoud. In November 1919, the British Secretary of State informed the British Civil Commissioner in Baghdad that, and I quote, "Kurdistan must be left to its own devices, and the practical question is how this can be done consistently with peace and security on the Mesopotamian frontier. We are advised by Noel that there are 3 essential conditions. 1, that Turkish authority should be excluded from Kurdistan. 2, that Kurdistan should not be partitioned. And 3, that the frontier should follow as nearly as possible the ethnological line between Kurds and Arabs. Noel's view is that Kurds, if left to themselves, will be strongly pro-British and will need no encouragement or assistance from us to keep the Turks out." However, Cecil Edmonds questioned whether Sheikh Mahmoud understood the role that the British had in mind for him. And again, I quote, "I have no doubt that Sheikh Mahmoud saw a benevolent British government intervening not to exercise any control over his rule, but only to prevent the Persian and the future Arab governments from interfering. Sheikh Mahmoud and his followers in Soleimani had a conviction that full independence would be achieved for the Kurds with the support of the British administration. In the words of Cecil Edmonds, the belief had little apparent justification, either in the physical appearance or commercial importance of the place, but it was always in the air and seemed to give what was little more than a tumble-down village something that I can only describe as a personality so strong that few Kurds could stay there long without succumbing to its heady influence. At the date of the British occupation, less than 70 years has elapsed since the end of Baban rule, and most of the adult population must have heard from their parents glowing and no doubt much embellished accounts of those earlier days of Kurdish independence. A poem, The Baban Land, by the celebrated Kurdish poet Shaikh Riza Talabani, expresses feelings that were doubtless widely shared. I remember Soleimani when it was the capital of the Babans. It was neither subject to the Persians nor slave-driven by the House of Osman. However, when Major Noel arrived in Soleimani, the town was in a bad way, with corpses lying in the streets and empty houses. According to some sources, just 1/4 of the town's population had survived the famine of 1914 to 1918. Noel's first duty was to provide food and clothing for the destitute, and these humanitarian services were recalled with gratitude in later years. Sheikh Mahmoud was informed that any Kurdish tribes wishing to accept his leadership would be allowed to do so. He was given the title of Hukmdar, or ruler, with a political officer to advise him. In April 1919, Major Noel was replaced by Major Sohn, also previously a colleague of Edmonds in Persia. Sohn, a man of very different temperament, imposed a more direct administration like the rest of the occupied territories. Major Sohn had worked as an accountant at the Imperial Bank of Persia, where he learned the Persian and Kurdish languages and converted to Islam. In 1909, he had made the journey described in his book, Through Mesopotamia and Kurdistan in Disguise, in which he travelled as a Persian to Soleimani and Halabja, for a time even staying as a guest of the Jaff family. Sensing that he was about to lose much of his autonomy, Sheikh Mahmoud organized an uprising. He was joined in this rebellion by the Hamawan tribe, some sections of the Jaff tribe, and also the 16-year-old future Kurdish leader, Mustafa Barzani. Surprising Soleimani at dawn on the 23rd of May, 1919, in a few hours Mahmoud had imprisoned the British personnel, seized the treasury, and hoisted his flag, a red crescent on a green background, in place of the Union Jack. It was clear that a full-scale operation would be required by the British to retake Soleimani. Edmonds was to accompany the expedition, which left Kirkuk for Chamchamal on the 15th of June, 1919. The next morning, Edmonds was up at 3:30 for a reconnaissance towards the Bazian Pass, which Sheikh Mahmoud was reported to be holding on both sides. Edmonds described the dramatic setting for the pending confrontation. In the clear morning light, we could see the long wall of the Karadag coming up from the southeast, dipping down in front of us to form the V-shaped gap that has been the scene of so many locally decisive battles. On the 18th of June, before daybreak and in complete silence, the British infantry began to scale the heights on each side of the gap and had nearly reached the top when, with the first light of dawn, their guns opened fire. Edmonds says little of the battle itself, but goes on to describe how he questioned 2 captured officers who had both seen Sheikh Mahmoud injured. Edmonds then received a note saying that a well-dressed Kurd, evidently a person of some importance, had been found lying wounded by the roadside. Edmonds found the man a little further on, describing him as wearing voluminous Kurdish trousers tucked into top boots of Russian pattern. One boot was ripped open at the ankle and blood was oozing through his shirt at the waist. Captain Bond, the APO for Chamchamal, was sent to Bazian to identify the distinguished prisoner and, on arrival, confirmed that it was indeed Sheikh Mahmoud. A statement published by the British on the 3rd of August announced that the whole of southern Kurdistan had been pacified. Sheikh Mahmoud, as soon as he was sufficiently recovered, was tried by military court for rebellion and condemned to death. The sentence was later commuted to one of 10 years' imprisonment, and he was exiled to India. However, this was not the end of Sheikh Mahmoud. In contrast with the dejected image of the captured Sheikh Mahmoud, Emir Faisal, who we last saw in Damascus, now reappears in our story, backed by T. Lawrence and other influential British figures. In January 1919, Emir Faisal led an Arab delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. With the support of Gertrude Bell, he argued for the establishment of independent emirates for Arab regions previously ruled by the Ottoman Empire. On the 8th of March 1920, Faisal was proclaimed king by the Syrian National Congress in Damascus. However, Faisal's reign was to last just 4 months. At the San Remo Conference of April 1920, the League of Nations mandate for Syria was allocated to France and the mandate for Mesopotamia to Britain, reflecting the earlier Sykes-Picot Agreement. Faisal's dream of an independent Arab kingdom of Syria was ended in July when the French ejected him from Damascus. The British, especially T. Lawrence, believed that Britain had reneged on its promises to the Hashemite family and, in effect, owed Faisal a kingdom. After World War I had ended for the Ottoman Empire with the armistice of Mudros, the Allied powers continued to occupy territory in Anatolia. Some Ottoman military officers therefore refused orders to surrender and disband their forces. On the 30th of April 1919, General Mustafa Kemal Pasha, later known as Ataturk, was dispatched to restore order. However, Ataturk resigned from the Ottoman army and became the leader of a Turkish nationalist movement, resisting the authority of both the Ottoman government and the Allied powers. Ataturk called for the establishment of a new Turkish Grand National Assembly in Ankara, which opened on the 23rd of April 1920. On the 10th of August 1920, despite rapidly decreasing power and legitimacy back home in Turkey, the Ottoman Grand Vizier signed the Treaty of Sèvres with the Allied powers, finalizing plans for the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire. The treaty included provisions for an independent Kurdish state, reflecting the earlier British plans drawn up in 1918. However, these terms stirred hostility back home in Turkey, where the treaty's signatories were stripped of their citizenship. From the end of 1918 until 1921, the situation in Iraq remained dangerously unstable. The British military administration was seen as infidels by the Shia majority and by many Sunnis who regretted no longer being under the caliphate. In 1920, a revolt began in Baghdad and spread to Shia areas in the south. Its demands were independence from British rule and the creation of an Arab government. In March 1921, Winston Churchill, by then Secretary of State for the Colonies, convened a conference in Cairo. The British government, alarmed over their position in Iraq, agreed to support the fugitive Faisal as candidate for a newly created throne of Iraq. The British hoped that Faisal, as a direct descendant of the Prophet, would be granted sufficient legitimacy by the Arabs, but as an outsider in Iraq, he was also weak enough to remain compliant to British interests. In June, Emir Faisal reached Basra in a British ship, and on the 23rd of August, after a referendum in which the affirmative vote was officially 96%, was proclaimed king. The Liwa of Soleimani refused to participate in the referendum, while the dissenting 4% was chiefly accounted for by Kirkuk, where the Turks favoured a ruler to be chosen from the House of Uthman, and the Kurds asked for a Kurdish administration. No representative from either Liwa attended the ascension ceremonies. After the Treaty of Sèvres, the Turks redoubled their efforts to impress upon the inhabitants of the Mosul Vilayet that it was not worth the paper it was written on. There were threats of invasion, warnings to traitors, and above all, the religious appeal for loyalty to the Sultan, who was also Caliph. In 1922, Major Soane left his post in Sulaymaniyah to be replaced by Major Goldsmith. Edmonds took up a temporary post on Halabja, describing the atmosphere on his arrival as distinctly jittery, with the outgoing APO on the verge of a nervous breakdown. At Rania, sections of the Pijdar tribe were in open rebellion. In August 1921, tribesmen had attacked the town with the aid of Turkish soldiers. Moreover, the APO had contracted a personal blood feud by shooting dead a local Aga. Meanwhile, the Bazanji Sheikhs were conducting an intensive war of nerves, hoping to secure the eventual return of Sheikh Mahmoud. The British were averse to the use of imperial troops in a remote area of no interest to them. Most of the British officials in Baghdad refused to accept that the Kurds, who had chosen to stay outside of the new Iraqi state, had any right to their assistance. In the absence of any will to govern on the British side, there seemed to be two possible options. The first would have been a unilateral decision to incorporate Sulaymaniyah and Kirkuk into the Iraqi state, whether the people liked it or not. But this would have been a breach of assurances which had been given in the British Parliament that the Kurds would not be forced into subjection to an Arab government. The second was the replacement of direct by indirect rule through a prominent Kurdish personality who could command general support and would not be vulnerable to Turkish propaganda. A senior representative of the Baban family, who was encouraged to visit Sulaymaniyah from Baghdad, was found to know no Kurdish whatsoever and to be interested only in the past history of his family. Major Goldsmith recommended that Sheikh Mahmoud should be reinstated. Edmonds and Major Noel expressed grave doubts about the wisdom of bringing Sheikh Mahmoud back. Edmonds proposed to look further afield, to Sheikh Syed Taha, grandson of a celebrated sheikh in Turkey. In May 1922, Edmonds took up a new post as APO Rania. One of the first communications he received was a note signed by the hostile Pijdar affiliated to Mahmoud Aga, stating that, owing to the concentration of governmental favours on Babak Aga, they were precluded from calling on him to pay their respects. The Turkish government had given one of their agents, Ramzi Bey, the title of Kamakam of Rounders and dispatched him to the district. On his arrival towards the end of May, he gave assurances of the imminent arrival of large Turkish reinforcements, with the help of which Sulaymaniyah, Kirkuk and Erbil were to be wrested from the British. He was followed in the middle of June by Colonel Ali Shafiq, popularly known as Uzdemir, meaning pure iron, who was to play the leading role in inciting rebellion among the Kurdish tribes. At the end of May, the Turkish incitement triggered a Hamawan revolt led by Karim Ifata Beg, who had joined Sheikh Mahmoud in the rebellion of 1919. Karim invited Captain Bond and his colleague Captain Makant to meet near the Bazian Pass on the 18th of June, supposedly to come to terms. The two officers, though warned that treachery was intended, considered it their duty to refuse no opportunity for peaceful settlement. Their suspicions were disarmed by the cordial greeting given to them by Karim, whose followers then shot them in the back while they rode by his side. By the 12th of August, Karim and the Hamawan reached Rounders, and on the 31st of August, the British suffered a surprise attack in Dabandaranya, forcing them to retreat. When Edmonds reached Kirkuk on the 4th of September, he learned that the British and Indian personnel had been evacuated by air from Sulaymaniyah the previous day. Before leaving Sulaymaniyah, Major Goldsmith had handed over responsibility to an administrative council, who in turn selected as their president Sheikh Mahmoud's brother, Sheikh Khadr. Sheikh Mahmoud himself had already been brought back from India as far as Kuwait. The logical development was a decision to allow Mahmoud back to Sulaymaniyah. In return, Mahmoud promised to prevent the Turks from entering the Liwa of Sulaymaniyah. He also accepted the condition that he would on no account interfere with the affairs of Kirkuk and Erbil. Sheikh Mahmoud left Baghdad for Kirkuk by train on the 20th of September, accompanied by Edmonds and Major Noel. The next morning, when they reached the railhead 4 miles from Kifri, hundreds of horsemen from the local tribes invaded the station, shouting and waving banners. They dragged the Sheikh away in triumph before an official deputation from Soleimani could give their speeches of welcome. While at Kifri, Edmonds met leaders of the Soleimani deputation and was impressed by the seriousness with which they were taking themselves as members of a temporary Kurdish national administration. Sheikh Mahmoud may have been sincere when he gave the assurance that he would confine his activities to the Liwa of Soleimani, but the rapturous welcome quickly erased any memory of the limits imposed upon him. He reached Soleimani on the 30th of September and was greeted as ruler of an independent Kurdistan. The local press emphasized that Major Noel, who had been appointed as liaison officer, was nothing more than a consul to serve as a go-between with the High Commissioner. On the 10th of October 1922, a decree given in Soleimani, the capital of Kurdistan, announced the formation of a cabinet. In November, Sheikh Mahmoud assumed the title of king. On 22nd of December, Edmonds delivered the following announcement from the British and Iraqi governments. His Britannic Majesty's government and the government of Iraq recognize the right of the Kurds to set up a Kurdish government and hope that the different Kurdish elements will, as soon as possible, arrive at an agreement between themselves as to the form which they wish that government should take. This text, in particular the use of the words Kurdish government rather than Kurdish administration, went far beyond anything which the Iraqi government and High Commission had previously endorsed. At the beginning of January 1923, Sheikh Mahmoud hoisted his flag in Rania. As the town was within the Soleimani Liwa, this was a legitimate move within the conditions laid down at the time of his return. Around this time, however, Edmonds intercepted correspondence from Ozdemir revealing planned attacks on Kirkuk and Koya in collusion with Sheikh Mahmoud. On the 20th of February, Edmonds telegraphed a message to Sheikh Mahmoud from the High Commissioner, ordering him to leave Soleimani. The British dropped bombs over the town on the 3rd of March as a final warning, and Mahmoud was reported to have fled the following morning. Sheikh Mahmoud set up headquarters in the Jasana cave near Surdash. He took with him the municipal printing press and, on the 8th of March, published the first issue of a newspaper, Bangi Haq, the Call of the Truth, printed at the general headquarters of the Army of Kurdistan. On the 5th of May, the British issued an operation order for retaking Soleimani, reading as follows: "We will march to occupy Soleimani town, with the object of effecting the defeat of Sheikh Mahmoud and the complete loss of his prestige, and of punishing those tribes which have evinced hostility." The British marched through the Bazian Pass on the 15th of May, repeating their advance of 4 years earlier. They reached Sashnar just outside Soleimani the following day, when notables of the town had been summoned in messages dropped by air. On the 17th of May, 2 of the rebel detachments came forward to surrender. 3 days later, Edmonds went with a party to Jasana Cave. Nearby, they found Sheikh Mahmoud's field telephone and typewriter, together with 2 royal standards. Villages showing any resistance to British authority were systematically burned. In one of his reports, Edmonds summarizes his view on controlling Kurdish resistance as follows: "Strength is what the Kurd understands, and he must be controlled by force, tempered with kindness perhaps, but still ultimately by force." However, Sheikh Mahmoud was unexpectedly given one final opportunity to take control of Soleimani. The British government, facing economic pressures at home, had been pressing for the reduction of imperial troops in Iraq to 6 battalions. On the 29th of May 1923, Edmonds received the surprising news that British forces would be withdrawn from Soleimani in the middle of June. Edmonds developed a plan to restrict the control of Soleimani to little more than just the central Qaza. Ahmed Beg, son of Adil Khanum, was appointed as Kamakum for Halabja, while Babakar Aga was paid a subsidy and put in charge of the Pijdar country. Sheikh Mahmoud was to be left to his own devices in Soleimani. He entered Soleimani on the 11th of July 1923, with his wider reach now heavily curtailed. The British defined his position in yet another official pronouncement, which Edmonds drafted in the following terms. The High Commissioner has heard that you have returned to Soleimani and has ordered me to inform you that he has made arrangements for the administration of the nearby Khazars. If you interfere in the said districts or intrigue against the government in other ways, the most drastic action will be taken against you. However, when Mahmoud began to expand his authority into the districts forbidden to him, the British bombing raids resumed. Arthur Bomber Harris, then a young RAF squadron commander, and later infamous for the bombing of German cities in World War II, reported after one mission in 1924, "The Arab and Kurd now know what real bombing means in casualties and damage. They know that within 45 minutes, a full-size village can be practically wiped out and a third of its inhabitants killed or injured." Meanwhile, in Turkey, the abolition of the Ottoman Sultanate by the Grand National Assembly of Turkey on 1st of November 1922 marked the end of the Ottoman Empire, which had lasted since 1299. The last Sultan departed the Ottoman capital on 17th of November 1922. The peace conference in Lausanne opened on the 21st of November 1922. The Ankara government, under Mustafa Kemal, rejected the territorial losses imposed by the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres. The promise of a Kurdish state made 2 years earlier was off the table. Turkey claimed the whole of Mosul Vilayet, while the British were asking for a frontier to correspond with its northern boundary. On the 24th of July 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed by the Allied powers with the Grand National Assembly, thus recognizing the latter as the legitimate government of Turkey. The treaty included the stipulation that the frontier between Iraq and Turkey shall be laid down in friendly arrangement to be concluded between Turkey and Great Britain within 9 months. In the event of no agreement being reached between the two governments within the time mentioned, the dispute shall be referred to the Council of the League of Nations. On 29th of October 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed, and on the 3rd of March 1924, the Turkish Grand National Assembly abolished the Caliphate, marking the end of Ottoman influence. The Turkish propaganda, which had kept Kurdistan seething like a volcano, had heavily relied until then on a lingering reverence among the Kurds for the supreme head of their religion. Meanwhile, owing to Sheikh Mahmoud's continued interference in the districts forbidden to him, the High Commissioner decided that Soleimani must, once more, be occupied by ground troops, and this was done in the middle of July 1924. Under the terms of the Treaty of Lausanne, Turkey and Britain had been given 9 months to settle the Mosul dispute. As neither side would compromise its position, on the 30th of September 1924, the League of Nations set up a special commission to survey public opinion in all parts of the Mosul Vilayet, asking whether they wished to be part of Turkey or Iraq. Cecil Edmonds was attached to the commission as liaison officer. Edmonds was convinced that Mosul's inclusion in Iraq was of vital importance for the survival and success of the new state. King Faisal himself presented the case to the commission as follows: "I can consider that Mosul is to Iraq as the head is to the rest of the body, and it is my unshakable conviction that though the question is only one of fixing a boundary between Iraq and Turkey, it is, in fact, the question of Iraq as a whole. Accordingly, the happiness or misery of 4 million human beings is placed in the hands of your honourable commission." When the commissioners reached Soleimani on the 27th of February 1925, they looked forward to hearing the opinion of a population who had given ample proof of their independence. Turkish members of the delegation expected strong support for Turkey. The Kurdish inhabitants had, after all, been in rebellion against the Anglo-Iraqi administration for the past 5 years. Edmonds, however, predicted that the majority would be willing to enter Iraq on condition that the local officials continued to be Kurds and that Kurdish continued to be the official language of the administration and in the schools. Leading citizens included Ahmed Beg Jaf and Mahmoud's brother, Shaikh pledged to denounce Turkey in front of the commission. Describing the incompetence and corruption of the Ottoman regime, the witnesses recalled with boastful delight occasions when the Kurds had defeated Ottoman garrisons sent to put them down, and cited the murder of Sheikh Mahmoud's father at Mosul in 1908 as evidence of the hatred between the two peoples. The Mosul Commission concluded its work on 23rd of March 1925 with the recommendation that Mosul Vilayet should be included in Iraq. The decisive effect of the testimonies heard in Soleimani was demonstrated by various references contained in the Mosul Commission's report. And I quote, "It was in the Liwa of Soleimani that the most definitive views were expressed. With very few exceptions, the persons we interviewed pronounced in favor of the Iraqi government. We found a Kurdish national feeling which, though yet young, was responsible and reasonable enough, for though the people stated that their supreme desire was for complete independence, they recognized the advantages of an enlightened, intelligent trusteeship." A treaty between the United Kingdom, Iraq, and Turkey was signed at Ankara on the 5th of June 1926. The estrangement of 11 years between Turkey and Britain was thus brought to an end. In a letter describing the way in which Soleimani had testified in favor of Iraq, Edmonds concluded, "The Kurds of Soleimani have struck what may prove to have been the decisive blow in the fight for the preservation of Iraq, and know it. Can the Iraqi government rise to the occasion and adopt a far-sighted and generous policy towards the Kurds?" With this prophetic question, Edmonds foresees the grim future of the Kurds within Iraq, which is, of course, another story. On the 27th of March 1925, Edmonds departed for Baghdad, where he took the post of assistant advisor to the Ministry of Interior. Progressive consolidation of the Iraq administration's power gradually reduced Sheikh Mahmoud to the status of a fugitive, dodging backwards and forwards across the Persian frontier, until he finally submitted in June 1927. Sheikh Mahmoud was exiled to southern Iraq in 1931, but was allowed to return to Darikli village near Soleimani in 1941, where he remained for the rest of his life. Faisal reigned on as king of Iraq until his death in 1933. Sheikh Mahmoud died in 1956, but remains a hero to the Kurdish people to this day, regarded as a pioneer for future Kurdish leaders. In a group picture taken during Cecil Edmonds' farewell visit to Soleimani in 1945, they are shown seated together, the first and only time since their first meeting in 1919, when the two were photographed together. I'd like to just propose a few short conclusions before we open up to questions. Firstly, I do believe that the British wished to see an independent Kurdistan, certainly at least an autonomous Kurdistan. I think that mistakes were made on both sides that led ultimately to the broken promise. The Kurds face the same major challenges then as they do now. Firstly, they are divided among themselves, and this makes it difficult for outside powers to see them as a viable state. And secondly, they're a landlocked country surrounded by more powerful nations, and this requires difficult compromises and allegiances. It does seem that Sheikh Mahmoud made great efforts to be friendly and hospitable to the British, and the British administrators were, for their part, extremely knowledgeable and enthusiastic about Kurdish history, culture, and society. It seems to have been an unfortunate series of misunderstandings and external events that led ultimately to frustration on both sides. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you found it informative and interesting. I'm not sure how the questions are going to be managed. Devan, I guess it's back to you now.